Winona and her children had been walking in the park for 3 hours. The weather was warm in September, and the children were happily playing, throwing multicolored leaves into the air. The leaves fell beautifully and rustled under their feet. To be honest, it was time to go home for dinner, and Winona was tired after work. However, her mischievous children kept begging, "Mummy, let's go for a little walk. Can we feed the swans with a bun on the pond? And then go straight home, okay?" Winona smiled and said, "Okay, run, but not for long, Billy. You're in charge. Hold Stacey's hand, she's very little, and stay away from the water." Billy, Carl, Kevin, Erin and Stacey rushed to the swans, while Winona waited for them nearby on a bench. She turned her face towards the sun and stretched out her swollen, tired legs. How wonderful it is to have children. Despite the challenges, they bring so much love with their little voices and hands. I hug them 100 times a day. Winona thought with pleasure. Suddenly, she saw her eldest son Billy running back to her and became worried. "Sonny, where is everyone? Did something happen? I've told you not to leave Stacey." But Billy quickly reassured her. "Mum, don't worry, everything is fine. Come with me. There's a grandmother sitting alone on a bench near the pond crying. I felt sorry for her. Maybe she needs help." Saying this, the boy grabbed his mum's hand and led her towards the pond. And indeed, a frail, hunched elderly woman with a small travel bag was sitting on the bench near the water. She held a tear-soaked handkerchief and quietly cried, her thin shoulders trembling. The children surrounded her and tried to comfort her in their own innocent way, offering toys or lollipops from their pockets. Winona realized that she needed to intervene and find out what was wrong. She called the kids. "Children, please, feed the swans and don't disturb us for a while, okay? We'll go home for dinner soon." Winona sat down next to an elderly woman and started a conversation. "Hello, my name is Winona. I'm sorry to bother you, but I couldn't just pass by someone who is in trouble. Is something wrong? Maybe I can help you with something." The elderly lady sighed sadly and replied, "Nice to meet you. I'm Mrs. Spertus. How can you help me? It happened that in my old age, I find myself without a roof over my head and nobody needs me. I don't know what to do or where to go. Out of despair, I even thought about ending it all in this pond, but I couldn't gather the courage." Winona was shocked, hearing such a desperation in the elderly woman's words, and asked, "How did this happen? What about your children, grandchildren, or your husband? Do you have any relatives at all?" Meanwhile, Mrs. Spertus continued, "Well, I do have 2 children, a son and a daughter. They both have their own families and children, but I was just an extra in their lives. They're planning to put me in a nursing home. I feel ashamed and scared at the same time. So this morning, I quietly packed my things and left without a clear destination." Winona was speechless and said, "That is terrible. How could they send their own mother to a nursing home? Why would they do that? I can't wrap my head around it. Please tell me more, we have time. My kids will be happy to run around." The elderly woman, wiping tears as they rolled down her wrinkled cheeks, began to share her memories. She had nowhere to rush to, and had been longing to talk for a long time. There was so much weighing on her soul. She felt drained. "I haven't always lived like this," she began. "I worked in a leading position all my life, as the director of a supermarket. Everyone in town knew me and respected me. My husband was also a respected man, working in manufacturing. We lived in a 2-story house with a balcony. We also bought apartments for our son and daughter and educated them in prestigious colleges. Kristen and Sherman, our children, grew up with so much love and pampering. We never denied them anything, always fulfilling their requests for clothes or toys. As soon as they finished school, they left our nest, got their education, got married, and had children of their own. They rarely visited us, and my husband missed them so much, especially when he became sick. Sometimes we would call our daughter and ask, 'How are you, my dear? When will you come to see us?' And the only answer was always the same. "Oh, Daddy, I don't know. I'm just so busy. I'm currently busy and overwhelmed with tasks. All right, I will call you back later. Please send my regards to Mum and goodbye." Our son frequently ignored my calls and always came up with excuses like not hearing the phone or being too busy. It was like that every time. And then it was 8 years ago my husband passed away after a long and painful illness. We spent a lot of money to afford his expensive treatment, but it was all in vain. When my beloved husband was buried, everyone left in the evening, leaving me alone with my sorrow. Since then I have been living by myself. There was no one to talk to, and I felt incredibly sad and lonely, to the point of wanting to cry. I have even forgotten what my son, daughter, and grandchildren look like. You know, my neighbours always spend their summer with their grandchildren, and I enjoy hearing their noise and laughter. To my great regret, my own children have never visited me and have never brought their own children. They are always on vacation at resorts and by the sea. I don't understand why. It's as if I'm a stranger to them. Then unexpectedly my daughter came to visit me 6 months ago. I was so happy. I baked pies and set the table. I couldn't believe they remembered me. However, things didn't go as I had hoped. Kristen started the conversation by saying, "Mummy, Sherman and I have been thinking, why do you need such a big house? You're old now and you have health problems. Let's sell it and I'll take you in. You'll be spending time with your grandchildren as you always wished. And honestly speaking, we really need the money. Step into our shoes. My husband's job is in crisis and Sherman's job is unstable. We could use some extra cash." The elderly woman went silent for a moment, immersed in unpleasant memories, and then continued. "I was deeply upset because I have lived in that house with my husband my whole life. Even the walls were dear to me. Of course, I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't fit in living with my daughter. On the other hand, I couldn't keep up with the cleaning and yard work anymore. I had high blood pressure and my heart would ache. Climbing up to the second floor was a struggle. My daughter also promised to buy me a small nearby apartment, and foolishly I agreed straight away. So the house was sold and I gave every penny of the money to my children and moved in with Kristen. And that's when my torment began. My son-in-law immediately took a dislike to me. He would get nervous when I sat down to eat with them in the dining room. He wouldn't let me join in conversation and would interrupt me. All I heard him say was, "Oh, don't start giving your stupid advice. We've managed without you and we're doing just fine." The grandchildren weren't particularly happy with my presence either. They were already teenagers and would resent their mother. They would say, "Why did you bring Grandma? We were cramped here even without her." I tried not to leave my room unless necessary, but my son-in-law made it clear that I was unwanted there. My daughter would often get angry too, saying, "Mum, don't go anywhere, don't touch anything. Can't you remember where things are?" I was so stressed out. I would cry in secret and regret agreeing to live with my daughter. I kept asking her when I would get the promised apartment. Kristen kept putting it off. "Why are you getting so worked up? My husband invested all the money into one profitable business. It's going to take off, and in 6 months we'll buy you an apartment. Besides, why do you need a separate apartment at your age? I don't understand. Does it really matter where you live?" Her words hurt me deeply. It turned out that I was a burden to everyone. Nobody values and respects old age. Rushing, I moved to Sherman's place, hoping that my son would be more welcoming, but it was not to be. He told me directly, "Mum, we didn't agree to this. Kristen should be taking care of you. She got more money from selling the house. Why did you come to me? I hope it won't be for long. You know my wife, Melissa, she's very sensitive and has a demanding job. She gets annoyed with strangers in the house." Just like that, he turned me away. I had to go back to my daughter. I was so offended. I had raised 2 children on my own, and now I had nowhere to rest my head. This morning, I was quietly walking to the bathroom, but suddenly heard a conversation in the kitchen. My son-in-law said, "Kristen, I'm sick of all this. Money is great, of course, but I can't tolerate your mum here for the rest of my life. She's always lurking around, sticking her nose in everything. Why don't we put her in a nursing home?" My daughter was initially indignant, saying, "Are you crazy? I promised her I would buy her an apartment. It was already a big lie, and now what? I can't do this to her. She is my mother, after all." But my son-in-law kept insisting. "What's the big deal? They take care of old people there, and there would be no more problems. She would be better off there. Besides, it's either her or me." I thought my daughter would defend me or kick him out for saying such things, but she surprised me by saying, "Well, maybe you're right. I'll think about it. You know how much I love you, honey. To be honest, I'm already fed up with my mother too. It's like a stone around my neck." After these words, I was not going to stay at my daughter's house for a minute. I waited until they went to work, packed my bag and left. My grandchildren were at home. They saw me leaving and didn't ask me a question. Nobody asked where I was going. Why? Because nobody cared about me. That's how it is, Winona. You've got 5 kids, I see, but it's not a fact that they'll warm you up in your old age. Although you seem to have them good, responsive. Maybe you'll be luckier than me. Winona was shocked by what she heard. She herself grew up in an orphanage and always dreamed of having at least one relative on this earth. But in this situation, there were many relatives. But the woman was thrown out on the street like an old, unwanted shoe. Winona's heart squeezed. She felt madly sorry for this poor elderly woman. Where will she go? What will become of her? She is not going to live on the street, is she? Thinking for a while, Winona called for her children and said in a businesslike manner, "So, my dears, Mrs. Spurtus will live with us. Do you mind?" All at once they all clamoured like a flock of little geese. "Hooray, we'll have a real granny now. That's cool. Will she tell us stories?" Winona took the old lady's bag and gave her a hand. "Come with us, Mrs. Spurtus, and please do not refuse. We need you very much. You can't even imagine to what extent. I really need an adult to look after my children. And you need a roof over your head, so we can help each other. I work as a cleaner in the office, and sometimes there is no one to sit with the children. I have to ask either a friend or a neighbour. Don't worry, they're good, well-mannered. You won't have any problems with them. Of course our place is a bit cramped, but it's fun. Well, do you agree?" Mrs. Spurtus even wept. "Thank you very much, Winona. I'll agree with pleasure. I'm so tired of loneliness, and I will gladly take care of the children. And frankly, I'll take any offer I can get, as long as I don't have to go back to my daughter." They all went home, to the apartment in an old building, and Mrs. Spurtus was surprised at the attention and care she was surrounded by. The only bedroom was clean and cosy. Bunk beds stood near each wall. The tables were sliding and did not take much space. Mrs. Spurtus was put to sleep on the sofa in the living room, where Winona had laid clean bedclothes. The children brought her warm socks with the words, "Granny, put them on because the floor is cold. You can catch a cold." They all dined together with a huge pan of fried potatoes, drank tea with pancakes, and chatted merrily. Mrs. Spurtus was surprisingly cosy and comfortable in this seemingly cramped apartment. From the first minute she really felt at home. After all, she was sincerely welcomed, and this was so touching and pleasant. When at last the restless little pranksters settled down in their beds and sweetly fell asleep after the promised tale, the women went into the kitchen. Winona took out a small bottle of homemade drink from the refrigerator. "Cherry with cinnamon. I made it myself. Let's have a small one, shall we?" I haven't had a guest for ages." Mrs. Spurtas dared to ask, "Winona, and how did you happen to be alone with 5 children? You seem to be still young. When did you have time to give birth?" The woman sighed sadly. "Oh, Mrs. Spurtas, my fate is not sweeter than yours. I am an orphan. I grew up in an orphanage. I only know about my parents from the tutors, that they drank heavily, so they took me away from my family. I was lucky to have good, kind-hearted teachers that didn't hurt us. They took pity on us. I got a job as a maid in a hotel. That's where I met my future husband, Gary. He was a trucker who often stayed overnight at our place. You know, I did not fall in love with him at once. Rather, he fell in love with me without memory. He courted me beautifully, brought me different gifts from his trips, like perfume or a ring. I was initially very frightened that he was older by 10 years and has 3 children. Gary did not hide anything. He honestly told me that his wife was a bad woman, and while he was on his trips, she did not get out of other men's beds. They always scandalized because she didn't take care of the children at all. She shouted at them. They irritated her all the time. And then she left them and went off to another lover for good. Can you imagine? She abandoned 3 of her own children. Well, the neighbours called Gary and reported that the children were home alone and crying. He rushed home, unable to fully believe that a mother could be so cruel to her own children. Billy, Carl and Erin are Gary's children from a previous marriage. Carl was even stuttering a little from nervousness, but we had cured him later. After a while, Gary deprived his ex-wife of her rights to the children and began hiring a nanny to take care of them while he was on his trips. What could he do? He had to feed his family. And then we met. He understood that I was young and unsure if I wanted to take on the burden of raising 3 children. So he initially suggested, "Let's go to the park with the kids this weekend, and you can talk to each other. If you realize that you don't want all this, I won't be offended. I understand that 3 children are a burden and a big responsibility. Plus, I don't know how they'll accept you. But let me make it clear, I won't abandon my children. It's either a big and loving family or no family at all. They've already suffered enough from a bad mum. They don't need a scoundrel for a father." That was the deal. When I saw how Gary carried Billy on his shoulders with balloons and pushed Erin in a stroller, who was only a year old at the time, something inside me changed. It was so unusual and touching. The kids welcomed me wonderfully, and I was happy to play with them all day long. Of course, our first meeting wasn't exactly a romantic date, but by the evening Gary and I had grown so close that we put the kids to bed together and I stayed at his house. For good. At first it was difficult. There were times when I cried from fatigue, especially when the children were sick and fussy. But my beloved always helped, encouraged me, and was there for me. Gradually I became so attached to the kids that I couldn't imagine my life any other way. They started calling me Mum. A year later I found out that I was pregnant. I was overjoyed, and imagine, it turned out that we were having twins. I was petrified, to be honest. The pregnancy was hard and I could barely make it. Kevin and Stacey were born, so suddenly we had 5 children. Despite all the difficulties, it was the happiest time. The first tooth, the first mummy, the first step. Gary was glowing with happiness, and we never differentiated between his children and mine. They were all ours, loved and cherished. Winona suddenly stopped talking, faltered, poured another shot glass, drank it in one gulp without snacking, and quietly said, swallowing tears, "And 6 months ago, Gary died in a car accident on a slippery highway. I don't remember the funeral well. I was unconscious most of the time. Just like that, instantly I became a 25-year-old widow with 5 children. I was terrified, and the children were crying and waiting for their daddy to come home. They kept asking when he would come, tearing my soul apart. I was in total despair, on the verge of giving up, and I didn't know how to go on. Times were tough. I had to sell Gary's house to have something to raise my children on and move here. My acquaintances still don't understand me. They think I'm crazy for not giving up the children for adoption. But I can't. You see, I just can't. I grew up in an orphanage myself, and I know better than anyone what awaits them there. It's a betrayal. They think I'm their mum. How can I abandon them? I had to look for a job, but with so many young children, nobody wanted to hire me. Who needs an employee who will be on sick leave all the time? I finally managed to get a job as a cleaner in a company. The boss took pity on me and hired me, but with the condition that I wouldn't take any time off or sick leave. So I kept working, always spinning. Sometimes I would ask my friend to babysit, or the neighbour. You know, small children often get sick. Yes, it's difficult, of course. The salary is not enough for such a big family, but I receive a child allowance, and some of my acquaintances give me their kids' things. I'm not picky. Billy started school this year, and I barely managed to prepare him. But it's okay. He's no worse than the others. As for work, some people like to tease me because they think that since I'm a cleaner, I must be a naive fool who had babies with anyone. And frankly speaking, it brings me to tears. Mrs. Spurtas also got emotional, cried and took Winona's hand. Darling, you are a true hero, Mother, and a clever woman. You're doing everything right. Everything will get better. The kids will grow up, and it will get easier. I will help you with great pleasure. We won't be lost, believe me. They continued talking and crying together for a long time. It seemed that with every tear shed, the accumulated grief and sadness from all those years were being washed away, and their souls felt lighter. That's how they started living together as one big and loving family. The children adored Mrs. Spurtas for her storytelling skills and her delicious pies made with cabbage and apples. The elderly woman seemed rejuvenated, standing tall and constantly smiling. She felt motivated and valued in this family, where there were no rules or restrictions. If someone accidentally broke a dish, they were not scolded, but instead helped to clean up. The older children took care of the younger ones, and Winona taught everyone to work. For example, when making dumplings, they all worked together, joking and laughing, even if some turned out misshapen. They happily ate them all. Cleaning was also done by the whole family. Even little Stacy and Kevin tried to sweep the floor. The young mother supported the children's efforts and praised their successes. Mrs. Spurtas was treated with warmth, respect, and care by everyone. In the small town, rumours started to spread that a mother with 5 children had taken in a poor old woman to live with them, even though they themselves lived in a small apartment. Many people knew Mrs. Spurtas and remembered her, and they also heard that her own son and daughter had kicked her out. Kristen and Sherman heard these rumours because people started to reproach and judge them. Some even stopped saying hello. Kristen was furious and once caught up with Winona when she was running home from work and gave her a tantrum right in the middle of the street in front of amazed passers-by. "Why do you need my mother? Why does she live with you? Did you take her in on purpose to embarrass me? For your information, I didn't kick her out. She ran away. Tell her not to fool around and come back." Winona was shocked, but she answered strictly, "I'm not forcing Mrs. Spurtas to stay with us. It's her decision. You better know what happened and why she was on the street. She is very much loved and appreciated in our family. You should be ashamed to say such things to me." But Kristen didn't stop quarrelling. "Be aware she doesn't have any valuables, or you have decided to make a benefactress out of yourself." Winona smiled. "You're wrong. She has the most important thing, a good heart, and I do not need anything else but you apparently do not understand this. Excuse me, I have to go. The kids are waiting." Sherman, on the other hand, was indifferent to the news that his mother lived with strangers. He saw it as one less problem for him. He had grown up having others make decisions for him and had never shown much initiative. He even found himself a well-off wife and didn't care much about earning money. Mrs. Spertus lived with Winona for 3 years and quietly passed away. Doctors only shrugged. Old age, weak heart. The woman was very sad and, in a burst of emotion, decided to search for Mrs. Spertus's negligent children. She hoped that they would at least show remorse in the end and be willing to contribute financially to the funeral. However, her hopes were shattered. Kristin hissed into the phone, refusing to help and suggesting that Winona bury her mother herself. Sherman didn't even answer the phone out of guilt, and his wife Melissa said that her husband makes pennies and she was not going to bury a stranger for her money. Winona was shocked by such cynicism and couldn't comprehend how someone could act in such a heartless manner. Despite struggling to gather enough money, she organised a modest funeral and wake for the old woman, ensuring a dignified farewell. To her surprise, many people attended to bid farewell to Mrs. Spertus. They expressed gratitude for her kindness and compassion, with some even offering financial assistance. However, her own children never showed up. It seemed they were too ashamed to face people and chose not to attend the funeral. Winona's kids were also missing their newfound grandmother dearly, remembering her enchanting stories, warmth and kindness. Winona often visited Mrs. Spertus's grave with them, taking care of it and sharing with her both the joys and sorrows of life. She had problems at work because she was completely hounded. Many people whispered and twisted their ears, saying, "Our cleaning lady is abnormal. She barely makes ends meet, has many children, both her own and others, so she must have enough problems. And she even paid for someone else's burial. She's crazy." Others mocked her to her face, saying, "Hey, Winona, can you give us some money? You have a lot of it, don't you? Since you're throwing a wake for strangers." The woman's eyes welled up with tears of anger. She wanted to respond sharply to all of them, to throw away the hateful mop and leave this toxic environment. But she couldn't. She had children to take care of. She had to support them and remain silent. 6 months after the death of Mrs. Spertus, Winona received a strange letter from the notary asking her to come to the bank. This must be some kind of mistake, she thought, but curiosity got the better of her, so she went on the specified day. It turned out that Mrs. Spertus had left a will shortly before her death, and she had a bank account with a significant amount of money. Nobody knew about it. Years ago, Mrs. Spertus and her husband decided to save some money just in case. They thought it would be helpful for their children in the future. Over the years, the money accumulated substantial interest. However, seeing how her own children treated her, the old lady changed her mind and bequeathed the money to Winona as a token of gratitude for her kindness and compassion. Along with the money, the notary gave Winona a letter, instructing her to open it only after Mrs. Spertus's death. With trembling hands, Winona opened the envelope and read, "Winona, my dear, if you are reading this letter, it means I am no longer alive. I want to express my heartfelt gratitude for the warmth and affection that you and your children showed me. The time I spent with your family was the best in my life. Please tell Billy, Erin, Kevin, Stacey and Carl that I love them dearly. Tell Carl to keep reading and not be lazy, and remind Billy not to forget his talent for drawing. Your children are wonderful and kind. I am certain that they will not grow up to be selfish like my own. I wish you all the best in life. I love you all, Mrs. Spertus." Winona clutched the letter to her chest, treasuring it as the most valuable possession, and sobbed as she remembered the honest and brightest elderly woman who had become a part of their family. With the money she received from the bank, Winona decided she would no longer work as a cleaner. She would finally be able to change the apartment for more spacious and take her children to the sea. It had been a dream for many years, and now it could become a reality. The next day, Winona took the kids on the bus to kindergarten and school. For the first time in a long time, she didn't rush to her hated work. Instead, she leisurely strolled through the stores. She treated herself to a beautiful summer dress with small polka dots and elegant sandals with a small heel. Afterwards, she visited the hairdresser, where she dyed her hair a beautiful brown colour and got a fashionable bob cut. She couldn't believe how happy she felt when she looked at her reflection in the mirror. She saw an entirely different woman, young, attractive, fashionable and self-confident. These were small joys that she couldn't afford before, due to her banal lack of money. She had to wear the same sweater and washed-out jeans throughout the year, and her hair was always tied up in a ponytail. An hour later, a young, beautiful and dressy woman entered the company's office and, with her heels clacking briskly, walked confidently to the director's office, ignoring the secretary. "Hello, are you here to see Mr. Weinberg?" the secretary asked, coming to her herself, finally. "How can I introduce you, and what is your question?" Winona laughed and replied, "It's me, Winona, the cleaner. Didn't you recognize me?" The secretary was astonished, her jaw dropping. She couldn't believe that this bright and beautiful woman with a stylish hairdo could be the same person who used to mop the floors at their office. In surprise, she asked, "You look spectacular, but are you going to mop the floors like that?" Winona smiled and said, "No, I won't be washing the floors anymore. Mrs. Spertas left me a large sum of money, so I'm leaving you and going to the sea with my children." The secretary could only respond with amazement. "That's incredible!" Later, when Winona picked up her kids from kindergarten, she wasn't recognized by the teachers or even her own children. Her twins, Kevin and Stacy, excitedly circled around her and shouted, "Mummy, is that you? Did you get a new hairstyle?" Carl, who was older, gave a thumbs up and said, "Mum, you're just gorgeous." Billy, coming home from school, looked at Winona in an adult way and said with admiration, "Mummy, you look so pretty. You are the most beautiful." During dinner, Winona asked in a mysterious voice, "Well, did everyone finish their porridge? Well done. You know, I have a surprise for you." Intrigued, the children couldn't resist and shouted, "Mum, what kind of surprise? Did you buy us a tasty treat? Or a toy?" Winona laughed and replied, "Mrs. Spertas gave us a lot of money, and we are going to the sea in a week. All together. Here are the tickets. Tomorrow we will go to choose swimsuits, swim trunks, masks and goggles for swimming. But there is one condition. You must obey your mum and not fool around." The excitement began. The kids screamed, jumped up and down and hugged Winona, exclaiming, "Hurrah! The sea! Mummy, you're the best!" The news of the large family going to the sea and the unexpected inheritance from the old lady quickly spread throughout the city, thanks to the chatty secretary. Kristen, upon learning the news, hated her late mother and Winona even more. She shouted throughout the apartment, "What a viper!" She pretended to be a benefactor, but she kept such a fortune for herself. How could she do that? Mum is so good too. Not a peep, not a word that she had so much money in the bank. She has her own grandchildren, but she left everything to strangers. Where is the justice? We should have put her in a nursing home and checked all her accounts. Winona and her children happily splashed in the warm and clean sea, spent time building sandcastles on the shore, and enjoyed delicious fruits during their vacation. Of course, Winona couldn't completely relax due to her concern for the children. She vigilantly watched to make sure they didn't get sunburned, always reminded them to wear hats, and in the afternoon, the whole family went to their room for a nap. Winona carried the responsibility of caring for the children on her shoulders, but she had long gotten used to it. The children were obedient, sometimes mischievous, but in moderation. Malcolm lived in a neighbouring cottage and watched the interesting and lively family as they enjoyed their vacation. He observed how skillfully Winona managed the children without any scandals or tantrums, and admired her. He was a widower. His wife had passed away a long time ago, and they didn't have any children. For 10 long years he had been consumed by loneliness and longing. Malcolm was well off, a lawyer by profession, and he interacted with different people at work. He could almost unmistakably determine a person's character and lifestyle. But this tanned, young and cheerful stranger with a bunch of children captivated him instantly. He tried to calculate her age, the ages of the children, but couldn't quite imagine when and how she had managed to give birth to all of them. He was deeply attracted to the woman, which was rare for him. He found himself admiring the way she smiled sincerely and warmly, how she unconsciously raised her bangs and gracefully turned her neck, giving him goosebumps. He pushed away these thoughts, thinking to himself, "Why would you need this lady with such a bunch of children? Are you crazy, you old fool? You're 42 years old and she's still young, maybe even married, and her husband just didn't come on vacation." Malcolm continued to watch them but didn't dare to approach and introduce himself, afraid of looking ridiculous. However, their meeting happened by chance, or fate. Carl and Erin were playing ball and accidentally hit Malcolm right in the forehead. The children were embarrassed and quickly ran up to him to apologise. "Oh, sorry, it was because of the strong wind. Are you hurt?" The man laughed and cheerfully tossed the ball back to them. "It's nothing at all. My name is Malcolm. And how about you, young athletes?" The boys introduced themselves and eagerly pulled Malcolm towards the rest of the family. He happily went along with them. Winona enjoyed playing with the kids and helped them dig a mini lake in the sand. She didn't immediately notice the stranger's presence. "Hello, everyone. My name is Malcolm. It so happens that I met 2 charming volleyball fans, and they invited me to join you. Am I interrupting?" Winona laughed and replied, "Hi, I'm Winona. Have my naughty boys gotten to you yet? They can. Of course, you won't be a bother. The more the merrier. Join us." And so, unnoticed, Malcolm and Winona spent the whole day together, swimming, sunbathing and getting to know each other. The time flew by cheerfully and interestingly. In the evening, after dinner, Malcolm timidly asked, "Winona, what are your thoughts on having a glass of fine wine here, not far away, on the terrace of the cafe?" Winona felt embarrassed. It had been a long time since anyone had made such a suggestion. "Only after I put the children to bed, and not for long, you know." Her heart fluttered with anticipation. She hadn't felt this way about meeting someone new in a long time. She really liked Malcolm a lot. He was pleasant and well-mannered. But what really won her over were his kind, radiant eyes. After putting everyone to bed, she wore her favourite polka-dot dress and applied light makeup before heading out to the cafe. Malcolm was already waiting for her with a full table of fruit and wine poured into beautiful glasses. When he saw her, he stood up and presented her with a beautiful bouquet of lilies, saying, "This is for you, Winona. You are as beautiful as these delicate lilies. I'm so glad you decided to come after all." The woman blushed, pleased with the attention. She couldn't remember the last time someone had complimented her. They sat down at the table and talked until almost midnight. Occasionally, Winona would check on the kids to see if they were asleep and then return to her conversation partner. Malcolm shared that he had been living alone for 10 years, as his family were tragically destroyed instantly by a drunk driver. He worked as a lawyer and earned good money, but aside from work he had no other life. That's why he would periodically come to this recreation centre, out of boredom. Winona couldn't and didn't want to lie, so she honestly told him everything about herself, her children, and Mrs. Spurtas. Incredibly, both of them felt like they had known each other for a lifetime, as they shared an easy and comfortable connection. When they said goodbye, Malcolm took the daring step of kissing Winona on the cheek, as if in a friendly manner. That kiss made the woman feel dizzy and incredibly good, something she had never experienced before. The rest of the night, Winona tossed and turned in bed, unable to get Malcolm out of her head. She was angry with herself, thinking, "What am I hoping for? That he will accept me with a bunch of kids? I must have overwatched soap operas. It's impossible. At most, I'll have a fling at the resort and that's it. But will that make me feel better? No, it will only make me suffer. I should forget about him. He'll leave and won't even remember our fleeting encounter, for sure." She persuaded herself the rest of the night, looking at how sweetly her little ones were sleeping, sprawled across the bed. For the rest of their vacation by the sea, Winona, Malcolm and the children were inseparable. They played volleyball, had fun, went to the zoo, imitated funny gorillas, fed the monkeys, went on yacht rides. So time flew by quickly. Malcolm realized that he hadn't felt this relaxed and happy in a long time. The children didn't stress him out or get in the way. On the contrary, when he interacted with them, it was as if he was transported back to a carefree childhood and could truly be himself. The day of departure arrived. Winona packed her suitcases, gathered the children, checked the documents, and suddenly there was a knock at the door. Malcolm entered, and seeing that the family were almost ready to leave, blurted out, "Winona, listen, I wanted to tell you, or rather invite you. Oh, I'm completely confused. Kids, I invite all of you to my home. I have a big spacious house with many grapes, a pool, a dog named Leela, and a cat named Timmy. But I'm so sad and lonely in such a huge house all by myself. There's a school and a kindergarten nearby. You'll love it. Who's in favour? Raise your hands." The joyful children shouted in unison and raised their hands, exclaiming, "Hooray! Mummy, we're going to Malcolm's." Then 1,000 questions followed. "Can we play with the doggy? Does Leela know any commands? Can we swim in the pool?" Winona protested. No, this is uncomfortable. Malcolm, why are you encouraging the children? We have to go home." She picked up her suitcase. The children were upset and quiet, but Malcolm winked at them and whispered conspiratorially, "Don't worry, I'll talk to your mother alone and persuade her. You'll see." They went outside. Winona frowned and said, "Malcolm, it's not fair to play with children's feelings. We're adults. Who are we pretending to be? You'll get tired of the noise and hassle, and then what? How am I going to explain all of this to the kids? Remember, children are not just happy all the time. They can be cranky and sick, and they need constant care and attention. It's not an easy job. Really, they are my family, but they're strangers to you. And what about me? Who am I to you? We've only known each other for 2 weeks. Why do you need me?" Suddenly, Malcolm pressed her tightly against him and passionately kissed her on the lips. She tried to resist at first, but then gave in, and they couldn't separate from each other for a long time. After catching their breath, Malcolm said, "Winona, I'm 42 years old and I'm a lawyer. I'm not someone who just says words without weighting them. I won't hide it. If someone had told me a month ago that I would fall in love so quickly with a woman I barely knew, who had 5 children, I would have thought they were crazy. But believe me, these past 2 weeks that we've spent together have been the best 2 weeks of my life. Since my wife passed away 10 years ago, I became hardened, cynical, and stopped believing in love. But you and your children have brought back the happiness of my childhood. With you, I feel like myself again, and I feel good. I understand the responsibility I have towards you and the children, and I promise I will never betray you or abandon you, no matter how difficult it gets. Let's make it official and live as one big and loving family." Winona smiled and said, Well, if that's how you feel, then I agree. The children truly love you, and children's hearts don't lie. And I fell in love too. She hugged him tenderly and then asked, "But what about work? Will I be able to find a suitable job in your city? I was only hired at my old age out of pity." Malcolm laughed and said, "Job? What do you need it for? Your true calling is to be a mother, and you're amazing at it. I have enough money to provide for our family, trust me." Winona felt like she was living in a magical fairy tale and was afraid to close her eyes, fearing that it would all disappear. Every evening, as they tucked their children into bed and lay together, Winona silently thanked her guardian angel, Mrs. Spurtas. Meanwhile, the seeds of anger and hatred that Kristen and Sherman had shown towards her mother soon bore fruit. Kristen was unexpectedly disabled in an accident and was left with no husband or children. She was placed in a centre for the people with disabilities without any hesitation. Sherman fell into debt and started drinking heavily, leading to Melissa filing for divorce and leaving him with nothing. Mrs. Spurtas's children became even more bitter, spending their days away from their relatives and suffering from the burden of loneliness. They didn't realize the simple truth. How you treat your parents is how your children will treat you. It's the law of life.